What did you forget?
No, no, no! It's Batman! Get the hell out of here!
Subtlety works. Every time.
Happy Halloween, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the spooky season. 15 years ago, Rocksteady Studios shocked the world when they debuted the most authentic superhero game of its time, Batman: Arkham Asylum. It was the game that gave Rocksteady the prestige and the merit to warrant further investment from Warner Bros. Interactive. What followed was a renaissance for the Batman IP, one which would go on to reinvigorate other developers' interests in the superhero genre. But after 2 successful entries in the Arkham franchise and 2 spin-offs courtesy of Warner Bros. Montreal, Rocksteady intended their 3rd game to be the last. An emotional capper that would be the perfect send-off for the Arkham franchise in its iteration of Batman, at least until the powers that be forced them to continue it. With development taking place over 4 years and Kevin Conroy once again returning to voice Batman, the stage was set for Rocksteady to deliver one hell of a final. Yet after so many years of waiting and a multitude of delays before release, a feeling of unease began to set into the hearts of many. Could this game truly deliver the definitive Batman experience we were hoping for? Or would it follow the path of Icarus and burn to cinders as Rocksteady attempted to reach heights too great for any one game to achieve? Well, let's find out. This is Batman: The Arkham Knight. It's Halloween night, 9 months after the events of Arkham City and the death of the Joker. Crime rates have plummeted, children can play in the streets, and all of the city's supercriminals have seemingly vanished without a trace. For a time, it seemed Gotham would finally know peace. But on this night, that peace is shattered when Scarecrow unleashes his fear toxin upon the helpless populace. Promising a bigger attack to come the next day, the GCPD wastes no time and begins a full-scale evacuation of Gotham, leaving them wide open for the city's criminals to seize control. Now the people of Gotham have only one hope of restoring peace to their city. Answering the call to action, Batman wastes no time in beginning his search for Scarecrow. Calling upon his allies, he quickly gathers as much information as he can on the impending threat and starts formulating a plan. However, it isn't long before things go from bad to worse as a large army shows up to occupy Gotham, led by the mysterious Arkham Knight, a masked figure who seemingly knows everything about Batman and holds a deep hatred for the Caped Crusader. He and his militia effectively take hold of the city's streets while Scarecrow's army of villains have free reign to do whatever they please to the city itself, forcing Batman and his allies to fight a 2-pronged war against an enemy hell-bent on destroying everything they hold dear. With the city falling apart around him, his allies struggling against the enormity of the fight before them, and a new unknown threat to deal with, Batman will have to push himself further than he's ever gone before if he hopes to save Gotham. Yet as the night wears on and new revelations are brought to light, Batman may just have to sacrifice more than his body if he hopes to keep those closest to him safe from harm.
Where is he?
I got nothing to say to you, Batman.
Talk, or I'll crush every bone in your body.
Okay, okay! She's working out of a penthouse in Chinatown. I swear that's all I know!
If you're lying, I'll break the other one.
The other one! Ah!
Well, you can't deny that Rocksteady certainly knows how to raise the stakes. This is easily the biggest night of Batman's life. Everyone from small-scale criminals to fully-fledged crime lords want to get a piece of him before it's all over. But as made clear during the early stages of this game's story, it's not just him that's in danger this time. Throughout this lengthy campaign, Scarecrow and his allies systematically target every facet of Batman's life, forcing him to adapt to every new development whilst remaining ever vigilant and constantly on the defensive, leading him to seek unconventional solutions to difficult problems and new allies in unexpected places. While the previous games were able to remove much of the threat posed to Batman's allies by keeping them literally at a distance from him, here that isn't the case. As a result, by the end of the game, you'll see the toll this conflict has had on both him and Gotham as a whole, leading to a rather poignant conclusion that speaks to the core of Batman's ideals, while at the same time going the extra mile to demonstrate just how terrifying a villain like Scarecrow can be when given the spotlight. One of the biggest disappointments I had with Arkham Origins is that once the Joker was revealed to be the actual main antagonist of the game, Black Mask was basically brushed aside and forgotten about. Despite being such a big part of the game beforehand, his story was ultimately resolved in a side mission, while the Joker took all the focus in the main narrative. So my biggest worry with the Arkham Knight was that Scarecrow would suffer the same fate in order to make way for some other villain, but thankfully that isn't the case. Rocksteady recognized the untapped potential Scarecrow had and brought him to the forefront for the final chapter of the Arkhamverse, allowing the character to show off his intelligence and demonstrate demonstrate firsthand just how terrifying he can be when given the right material. With or without the Knight, it's pretty clear that this man has backup plans for his backup plans. Anytime Batman thinks he stopped him, he reveals that all his work was simply setting the stage for what comes next. By the end of the game, you can't help but admire his villainy. Despite this game being named after the newly introduced Arkham Knight, Scarecrow felt like an actual main antagonist, one who you could both fear and respect, which only makes me wish we got to face him in some spectacular fear-induced boss fight like in Arkham Asylum. We kinda got that as DLC, but such a set piece really should have been reserved for the main campaign rather than as a bonus side challenge. Safe to say, this is a genuinely good story, one that isn't afraid to show the worst parts of a DC Comics villain whilst also continuing to remind you that at their core they're all human, each with their own personal issues that under better circumstances could have been mended, but due to the nature of the Arkhamverse, everyone has effectively been condemned to their own perpetual hell. At the same time, the game's supporting cast comprises of a series of densely layered characters, each with their own personal drives that would normally lead them onto the right path. But due to unforeseen events in the story, that same drive that once inspired them to do right may in fact lead them towards a path of self-destruction. When you look at this game for what it's trying to do, it's hard to dispute the quality of its writing. That said, for what is supposed to be the conclusion to Rocksteady's Batman trilogy, I have to say the writers made some very questionable decisions for its story.
Well, Batman, old boy, this is quite the dilemma, isn't it? Do you save the incompetent friend who got herself kidnapped, or the incompetent friend who got herself kidnapped? Personally, I go see Eddie's latest contrived death gauntlet. I'm sure he went to a lot of trouble.
For starters, there's the Arkham Knight. While having a villain who understands Batman's tactics and can predict his actions is fitting for this kind of narrative, the biggest problem with him is that his inclusion feels incredibly contrived. Whereas Hugo Strange and the League of Shadows were able to organically slide into Arkham City's narrative, despite all the presumed history between them and Batman, the Arkham Knight's inclusion feels far too premature for a story like this, especially when a big part of his character is defined by his history with Batman. The Knight shows up in this game harboring a grudge that rivals Kratos' vendetta against the Greek gods. But since we never actually got to see any of this slowly festering hate for Batman beforehand in any of the other Arkham games, this revenge plot kinda falls flat on its face. Maybe if the Knight was a character who'd been a part of the Arkhamverse from the start, this could have worked? Like, they could have had him show up in Arkham Origins and have that game serve as the foundation for his whole story. In fact, it's kinda surprising that nobody at Rocksteady stopped to consider that when Warner Bros. Montreal was developing the game. I can only assume they didn't do this in order to prevent the possibility of his identity being spoiled. Not that it would have mattered anyway, his identity is pretty fucking obvious. Anyone who's read a Batman comic already knows who he is the moment he starts talking, and even if you don't realize it, once you reach the midpoint, you're basically hand-delivered his origin story on a silver platter. Frankly, it would have been more of a shock if the Arkham Knight wasn't who Rocksteady had chosen. Simply put, the developers didn't do enough to hide his identity. As a matter of fact, despite being advertised as such, the Arkham Knight isn't treated like a proper mystery at all. Throughout the entire game, Batman makes no attempts to deduce his identity and instead leaves it to Alfred while he carries on with the rest of the game like nothing's wrong. After going to great lengths to show how skilled he is at detective work in Arkham Origins, you'd think Rocksteady would want to build upon that, especially when we consider how well received that game's story was. Furthermore, with how serious the stakes are in this game, wouldn't it make more sense for Batman to handle the detective work himself? I mean, it's not like he's slowly transforming into the Joker over the course of this game. Speaking of which, did anyone seriously believe Rocksteady wouldn't find a way to bring the Joker back? Even if you were to ignore the two prequel games that Rocksteady hadn't developed, it's been made pretty clear since Asylum that Rocksteady's Arkham series is about the relationship between Batman and the Joker. So having the Joker return as a psychedelic hallucination fueled by Scarecrow's fear toxin is a neat idea to finish off their story. But then they took it a step further with Batman slowly becoming possessed by the Joker blood in his system, effectively warping his mindset and turning him into the very monster he sought to destroy. Granted, while this does go a long way to explain Batman's more militaristic outlook in this game, it does feel rather forced at times. Frankly, I think this part of the story would have worked better if we didn't have a definitive answer as to what the Joker was. A little ambiguity would have worked wonders and seriously ramped up the fear factor. Was he actually a hallucination, a byproduct of the blood transfusion Batman received in Arkham City, or something more? Nobody knows, but the possibilities would be terrifying to consider. If Rocksteady had just done that, then they could have gotten rid of the whole fake Joker side plot, which in turn would would give them ample room to provide Harley with a more engaging narrative, like continuing her revenge against Batman by targeting Robin. Considering Robin was the reason Harley couldn't kill him in the post-Arkham City DLC, it would make sense he would now be the focus of her revenge. Such a change would have gone a long way to justify the previous DLC's inclusion whilst adding more weight to Harley's development, rather than having her regress to being subservient to yet another Joker. In essence, they could have effectively laid the groundwork for Harley becoming a truly independent villainess like how she was supposed to be presented in the Suicide Squad, but I suppose that was asking for too much.
How did she find us? How did she get in?
I'd let him know if I were you. He's not always in such a good mood.
How should I know? I guess she's smarter than you think. Not likely.
This seems to be a reoccurring issue with Batman the Arkham Knight. While the core narrative is still incredibly engrossing, there are many areas that with just a bit of tweaking could have been so much more compelling. But it seems that in choosing to focus on this new villain and the slow corruption of Batman's ideals, they ended up either abandoning or cutting short a lot of more promising storylines. For example, both Hush and Azrael were a big part of the open world in Batman Arkham City. Both men were each given a long storyline that effectively set the stage for them to be a major focal point come the sequel. And yet, in Batman the Arkham Knight, both men ended up being regulated to just more side content, with Hush not even being given the dignity of multiple in-game missions. He just gets taken out in a QuickTime event after a brief cutscene. At least Azrael gets his own dedicated storyline, but even so, it's just a lesser version of Nightfall. Hell, it's not just these two. Among their vast array of post-game DLC, the developers also included the Season of Infamy, which is a collection of side missions focused on some of the Arkham trilogy's most notorious characters: Mr. Freeze, Killer Croc, Mad Hatter, and the League of Shadows, all of whom, except for Mad Hatter, were once major players in the Arkhamverse, but now they're all regulated to just being DLC side content. Considering how much of a fixture they've all been within the canon of the Arkhamverse up until this point, it feels in bad taste to have them be absent from the base game. Still, at least by having them as DLC, it did give the developers the time they needed to tell a lengthy story for each character. I just wish I could say the same for some of the characters in the base game.
My face!
It's become clear to me that while Rocksteady managed to tell a cohesive story that perfectly encapsulates Batman's character, the struggles he faces defending Gotham, and the mental toll that this lifestyle can have on a person, they didn't get to tell the story they originally wanted to in this game. It feels like at some point during development, Rocksteady stepped back from whatever narrative they had originally planned and chose to go in an entirely different direction. One that introduces numerous plot elements that were non-existent beforehand, resulting in a story that feels lacking in many key areas. Perhaps this was an unintended consequence of Rocksteady removing their original writing staff and replacing them with entirely new people. It would certainly go a long way to explain some of the game's more unexpected plot points. At one point, the game could be giving the player ample time to take in some new plot developments, while at another, you could be moving so fast through the story that you're barely given any time to breathe, let alone understand what's going on. It might sound like I'm being nitpicky, and honestly, I don't want to be. Despite whatever issues I have with this game's story, I still really like it. It's just so frustrating to see these writers stumble right at the finish line. They were so close to making this the perfect Batman game, one that is able to capture the Caped Crusader both narratively and mechanically without having to sacrifice either. It's hard to think Rocksteady could find a way to improve such a well-defined combat system, but they found a way, and thankfully it didn't require them to reinvent the wheel to do it. All they needed to do was maintain the core fundamentals of the combat whilst adding a lot more variety in both the gameplay mechanics and the enemies you encounter. You could say the solution was simple, but if you're already familiar with this franchise, then you'd know that there's nothing simple about the free-flow combat. It's easily one of the most innovative combat styles that's been implemented in gaming as of late. By utilizing a combination of strikes, blocks, counters, dodges, and gadget-based weaponry, Batman is able to keep fighting his enemies while seamlessly moving between different targets, ensuring a constant stream of brutality so long as you don't take damage. It's a combat style that perfectly adapts Batman's martial arts expertise, while also showcasing his proclivity for using absurd pieces of technology. So long as you maintain awareness of your opposition, the free-flow combat allows the player to effectively sustain their momentum without sacrificing any speed. But it's here where things get complicated. Thanks to a far more powerful generation of game systems, Rocksteady can render far more enemies on screen than they ever could before, while also adding as many variables as they want for each combat encounter. So at any moment, a one straightforward brawl can quickly transition into a chaotic cacophony of violence. Consider your enemies. In past Arkham games, you could end up fighting everything from bare-knuckle brawlers to guys armed with shields, shock batons, knives, and even guns. Occasionally you'd fight a superpowered foe, but on most occasions you'd be dealing with a very straightforward selection of criminal combatants, all of them tailor-made to throw the player off balance. But here though, the complexity of your enemies has been greatly enhanced courtesy of the Arkham Knight's militia. Now you'll have to contend with medics who can shield enemies in electrified fields and even revive unconscious ones, sword-wielding ninjas who need to be countered multiple times in order to land a single hit on them, and brutes who must be stunned first before they can even be hurt. As if that wasn't bad enough, these giant enemies can also wield weapons. Everything from Gatling guns to tasers and even blades. Not only that, at random intervals an enemy might start charging at the player, and if you're not quick enough to counter them, then this attack will completely disrupt your current combo chain, forcing you back to square one. More so than any other game in this franchise, enemy variety is a key aspect of the combat. With the militia being specifically designed to target Batman's weaknesses, it puts pressure on the player and forces them to constantly adapt to every new situation. Whether by attending to all the unique enemies first, prioritizing those with weapons, or simply focusing all your attention on one particular enemy before dealing with anyone else. The player needs to be constantly on their toes and prepared for anything, lest they end up being overwhelmed or taken off guard by some unexpected threat. Of course, with so many new threats to contend with, Rocksteady needed to provide players with the means to shift the combat in their favor, otherwise all these new additions had the potential to throw off a perfectly balanced combat loop. The first step they took was via the gadgets. As you progress through the game, Batman will acquire a vast array of different gadgets, most of which can be used in combat via a quick button input. From traditional stuff like the Batarangs, ideal for dealing with charging enemies or stunning your opposition, the Batclaw, a close quarters grappling hook tailor-made for pulling enemies close or disarming armed foes, the Explosive Gel, which has the potential to incapacitate large groups of enemies, ideal for when players are being overwhelmed, and the Smoke Bomb, a multi-purpose device for when you desire a quick getaway or to simply blind your foes, to more outlandish gear like the Freeze Blast, which can encase enemies in ice, temporarily halting their advance, and the Remote Electrical Charge, a gadget perfect for countering enemy attacks or even sending them flying. Each of these gadgets has its own role to play in the combat, with many of them tailor-made for slowing down the Arkham Knight's more complex enemies. With the right upgrades, you can even render much of your opposition unconscious within the opening moments of a fight. But should you misstep or ignore a particularly difficult enemy in favor of someone else, then you might end up backing yourself into a corner, one which not even a souped-up gadget can save you from. This is where you'll have to start considering how best to use your environment.
I like it. Oh.
Never forget you're Batman, and Batman doesn't play fair in a fight. While in past games, environmental takedowns were usually restricted to just stealth encounters, now they can be applied to the combat. If as you're fighting, you see anything in your environment flashing blue for a moment, like a light fixture, then Batman can turn that object into a weapon and instantly eliminate his opponent, regardless of their size or how much health they might have. Meaning that if given the opportunity, you can swiftly eliminate any enemy without having to waste time building up your combo meter. That said, every environmental takedown only has one use. So if you're in the middle of a fight and end up wasting them all on just standard enemies, then you won't have any means of instantly eliminating any of the game's more challenging foes should they make an appearance. Naturally, the last thing you want to do in a multi-phase fight is waste all your best moves on just the standard enemies, only to then have to deal with a bunch of specialized combatants with nothing but your gadgets and fists to rely on. As such, knowing when and where to apply these unique takedowns in a fight can often make the difference between success and failure. It's a similar case when dealing with armed opponents. As mentioned earlier, many enemies tend to bring weapons with them into combat, and like in past games, if you built up a large enough combo, then you can swiftly destroy their weapons, removing another potential threat from the battlefield. While now, if given the opportunity, you can also steal any blunt weapon from your enemy and use them to drastically ramp up your damage output, making them an ideal tool for piercing through the defenses of brutes and shielded enemies. The trade-off is that these weapons will break after delivering sufficient damage to your opponents or if they were used in a combat takedown. However, considering how often enemies use blunt weapons, this quickly proves to be one of the most reliable methods players can find to build up their combo meter, so it's best to take advantage of their power boost whenever you can. The same can be said of dual play.
Take on.
All yours.
One of the biggest new additions to the game's design, this effectively transforms the Arkham Knight into a two-player game. During key moments throughout the game, Batman will find himself teamed up with another member of his Bat family, Robin, Nightwing, and even Catwoman. Each of these characters has been playable in some form throughout this franchise, but this is the first time all three characters play a role in the game alongside Batman. With just the press of a button, players are able to seamlessly switch between Batman and his allies, effectively giving the player access to a whole host of new gameplay mechanics. Whilst dual play is in effect, any active combos are maintained whenever switching between different characters. So hypothetically, if a special move became available to you, then players would be able to change to a different character without losing it. Furthermore, an additional circular meter will become available to the player, which upon being filled will allow you to perform a tag team takedown, simultaneously allowing you to switch characters and instantly take out a foe at the same time. An ideal method for removing a difficult foe from the battlefield and changing up your fighting style. Furthermore, when they're not in use, the second character will react accordingly, fighting against your foes and moving about the battlefield as if you were in control. So even when you're not issuing orders to them, they are actively contributing to your survival. See, it's additions like these that go a long way to exemplify the core of Batman's fighting style. He's not simply a one-man army, but a tactical genius who takes advantage of every single aspect of combat in order to ensure a decisive victory. That's why more often before every combat encounter, you'll have the opportunity to assess the situation and determine what kind of opposition you'll be contending with. Who's carrying weapons, what environmental takedowns are available, is there anything you could hack into, and can you manipulate the environment in any way before combat begins? Asking yourself questions like these is the most effective way to ensure success in battle, whether it be open combat or a stealth encounter.
Drone's gone crazy. It's targeting me.
Since the beginning of this franchise, the Predator encounters have served as a means to test a player's patience and creativity. With every enemy armed to the teeth, you'll need to carefully navigate a hazardous environment while picking them off one by one, all the while being mindful not to make too much noise lest you draw everyone's attention and bring about a swift demise for Batman. Much like the combat, the core of Batman's stealth mechanics remains unchanged, but now with the introduction of the militia, the developers have dialed up the complexity significantly. Now enemies can do more than simply block out your detective mode and alert each other if one of their friends is incapacitated. Some soldiers have optic camo, making them impossible to see in detective mode, while others control drones that actively pursue you throughout the environment. You have soldiers who can lay out mines to hinder your movements, soldiers with thermal scanners that can see you even while hidden, snipers that strike you from afar, and even large brutes that require you to expose yourself for long periods of time just to bring them down. Evidently, there's a lot more to take into account when planning out how to tackle a Predator encounter. But like the combat, Rocksteady found a way to keep these sequences challenging without making it unfair for the player. For starters, thanks to next-gen tech, Batman can traverse his environment faster than he ever could before. What was once a slow crawl from point A to B is now a constant rush of adrenaline as Batman zips and slides across the map. Then we've got the gadgets, several of which are specifically tailored for stealth encounters and can greatly improve your odds of success. With the new remote hacking tool, Batman can easily interact with his surroundings without having to reveal himself, allowing you to take down enemies with environmental hazards or even interfere with their technology. Then there's Batman's disruptor rifle, which can sabotage everything from guns to medics, stun batons, weapon crates, and even mines. With the flexibility it offers, you'll cherish every round within its limited capacity. The same could also be said of the voice synthesizer, a gadget that allows Batman to impersonate enemy commanders and issue orders to their men. The ideal tool for setting up traps. But be wary, using it too much will eventually cause enemies to wise up and ignore your calls, so make sure to use it wisely. Combine any of these gadgets with the rest of Batman's arsenal, along with the potential potential inclusion of a second playable character, and what you have is a gameplay loop that embraces creativity and thinking outside the box. One which, like the combat, allows you to tackle any situation however you want, whilst also being mindful that your enemies will be constantly working to counter whatever plan you've set in motion. With Batman's large stockpile of gadgets at his disposal and the vast array of enemies you'll have to fight, rarely will any two Predator encounters play out the same way.
Something's interfering with it! I lost control!
It's the bat! Screwing with it!
From the start of this franchise, the developers have openly embraced the idea of an ever-changing gameplay loop, one that is defined by a player character that constantly adapts to every situation, where the only real limits are found with the players themselves. From Arkham Asylum to Arkham Knight, it's been fascinating to see how Rocksteady has expanded upon this initial concept, transforming a pretty straightforward superhero brawler with a dash of Splinter Cell into an epic action adventure that at any moment can become as tense as any decent horror game. This is best showcased by the new Fear Takedown, a unique special move that requires you to perform several silent takedowns in order to charge it. But once done, it allows Batman to take down up to 6 enemies in rapid succession. It's the perfect tool for beginning combat and removing any unique enemies from the battlefield. That said, using this move creates a lot of noise, so stealth-wise it can be quite the risk. However, if timed correctly, you can effectively remove a large number of fighters before any of them could even lay a finger on you. Essentially, this is a move that can be tailored for any situation, perfect for an adaptable fighter like Batman. But even so, while the gameplay surrounding Batman has never been as engaging as this, can the same be said for the Arkham Knight's biggest addition to this franchise? The Batmobile. Ever since the start of this franchise, Rocksteady has teased fans with the idea of getting to drive around Gotham in Batman's signature vehicle. But now, with a fully realized Gotham to explore and plenty of open roads, finally we get to experience the Batmobile in all its glory. So how does it hold up gameplay-wise? Well, that's where things get tricky, because more so than any other element of this game's design, the Batmobile's implementation is very divisive. Most who've played this game tend to fall into two categories. Either they hate the Batmobile, or they don't. Me personally, well, I kinda have to sit on the fence on this one. Don't get me wrong, I tried to form a decisive opinion on this, but every time I try to lean one way, I always end up leaning in the other direction as well, which is rather perplexing. Why is this one aspect of this game so divisive? Is the Batmobile simply a case of bad design, or bad implementation? Well, let's start with the basics and try to figure this out. So basically, the Batmobile is a supercharged vehicle that can be summoned to the player's location at any given time, whether you be on foot or in the air. Aside from gliding, it'll be your go-to for getting around the map fast, and oh boy can this thing move. With a built-in jet engine and some easy-to-master controls, the Batmobile can take you from one corner of Gotham to the other in only a matter of seconds. Sure, due to its rather flexible design, you might find the car difficult to handle at first, but after enough time spent driving around the city, you'll be able to easily maneuver around its many tight turns. Furthermore, thanks to its armor, you don't need to worry about damaging your car beyond repair, unlike some other games. In fact, aside from buildings, you can smash through pretty much anything in your path while driving. So right from the outset, the developers make it clear to you that this ain't no ordinary car, and if that ain't apparent to you from the start, then it'll become pretty clear to you once you see the Batmobile transform into a tank.
60mm cannon operational. Riot suppressor engaged.
What makes the Batmobile one of the more unique vehicles in gaming is the fact that it has two separate modes, with each playing a key role in how you utilize the car in the game. There's Pursuit mode, which you use mostly to get from point A to B, chase down enemy cars, or complete racing challenges, and then there's Battle mode, which is the more divisive element of the car, because on the one hand, it's integral for completing the many puzzles and platforming challenges found throughout the game, but on the other hand, its primary function is so that you can fight against the militia's army of drones. These drone battles make up the vast majority of your time spent with the car, and they can range from surprisingly fun to downright tedious. Essentially, the tank combat is broken down into 3 core components: mobility, weaponry, and special abilities. While in battle mode, the car's mobility is greatly enhanced, allowing for a full 360-degree range of movement, including the ability to strafe in any given direction. This is imperative since the enemy militia will often fire at you in a straight line, with only specific enemies being able to target you directly, so you'll need to be able to move freely in order to avoid taking damage. Thankfully, the developers provided you with in-game indicators so you know where and when you should move. Afterwards, it'll be the ideal time for you to make a counterattack with one of the Batmobile's many weapons. You've got the Vulcan Cannon, a fast-firing weapon capable of quick but minimal damage. When upgraded, this can effectively cripple drones by targeting key areas of their design. Then there is the 60mm cannon, a slow-firing weapon that deals high levels of damage and when upgraded can basically one-shot most types of drones. Together, these 2 guns make up the groundwork for the remainder of your arsenal, which consists of a series of special abilities that can only be triggered upon acquiring enough energy from combat. Each of these abilities has the potential to drastically alter the landscape of the battlefield. From simple stuff like being able to summon a barrage of missiles to destroy enemy tanks, to more complex powers like hacking into enemy drones and turning them against their allies, or activating an EMP to temporarily stun any enemies within a finite area. The power and scale of these abilities will ultimately be determined by how much energy you've managed to accumulate in battle. So depending on the situation, you might find it better to employ some weaker abilities against a large horde rather than trying to wait until you have a maxed out energy meter so you can overpower everyone. Despite the Batmobile being such a massive shift in gameplay, it's good to see that Rocksteady has tried to maintain the same core principles that have made the rest of this franchise so much fun. Even in this state, the enemy AI is difficult enough to keep the combat engaging, but not so much that it becomes impossible for the player to achieve victory. So long as the player remains on their guard and they manage their energy meter efficiently, there's no threat that they can't deal with. Sadly, where things have gone wrong is in regards to the variety with the combat. You see, despite the unique setup, it doesn't take long for combat with the Batmobile to become very repetitive. What made both the free-flow combat and the Predator encounters so compelling was the ever-changing roster of enemies, which when working in tandem with the player mechanics would result in a combat loop where no 2 fights would ever play out the same. This is where the Batmobile's gameplay struggles, because while you do unlock new combat mechanics in the form of the aforementioned special abilities, when compared to the overwhelming amount of diversity found with Batman's gameplay, the Batmobile is quite lacking. In universe, I can understand why you're far more limited in the car when compared to out in the field. After all, there's only so many places you can add new tech to a single vehicle before your suspension of disbelief is broken. But still, given Batman's ever-evolving nature, you'd think Rocksteady would try harder to shake up the Batmobile's gameplay. For example, they could have given the player the ability to swap to different types of guns when not in combat, or include in-game hazards that if interacted with could damage enemy tanks or even the player themselves. I mean, the game already features a destructible environment, couldn't they have just leaned a little further into that? Hell, the developers tried to shake things up by including Predator encounters with the Batmobile, but these just amounted to slowly driving around, shooting an exposed weak point on a tank and then running away from all your pursuers before repeating the process until everyone is dead. So it's basically a slower and less exciting tank battle. Are you starting to understand why this car is so divisive? It's not simply a case of it being badly designed, far from it. The car is as finely tuned as any other aspect of the Arkham Knight's gameplay. When you're simply out on the open road, chasing down cars and indulging in some of Eddie's elaborate races, it's easy to lose yourself to the adrenaline rush. But whenever you're forced to slow down and take on one of the game's drone battles, it can feel like the game is stonewalling you. It doesn't help that around a third of your time spent in any given playthrough is taken up by the car, and considering how firmly ingrained the tank battles are in the main story, this means that a good portion of your time will be focused solely on these slower and less engaging car segments. Still, with enough time and practice, these roadblocks in an otherwise enjoyable gameplay loop can remain brief. You just gotta make sure to upgrade your car whenever you get the chance. So it's pretty easy to understand why I'm on the fence with the Batmobile, because whether it was intentional or not, it's designed that way. The car is simultaneously a fine addition to the core gameplay loop and one of the most monotonous parts of it. At one moment you could be driving at breakneck speed, slamming into cars and casually ruining the lives of Gotham's criminals, while at any other moment you could be slowly fending off waves of drones just to defuse a bomb or defend a plant. This seesaw of quality can seriously tarnish an otherwise fine gameplay experience. Still, when you're cruising along the streets of Gotham, putting down criminals and saving lives, it's easy to look past any of the issues the Batmobile has and just enjoy the ride. With a game world approximately 5 times the size of Arkham City, split into 3 distinct islands, the sheer scale of Gotham City cannot be overstated. Every corner you turn there are enemies to fight, collectibles to find, and stories to be told. But how you choose to uncover this city's mysteries is entirely up to you. Thanks to the Batmobile's speed and its built-in ejector, Batman can effectively propel himself through the sky, while the new and improved grapnel gun is now capable of latching onto multiple targets in quick succession, essentially giving the player more control over their movement before launching themselves skyward. Together they can simultaneously help you save time on exploration without having to slow your momentum. So whether you travel by car or through the air, safe to say traversing the open world has never been easier than this. As you progress through the game, you'll gradually unlock new side missions, each of which can be tackled at your own pace and offer you tech points upon completion, allowing you to further strengthen Batman's arsenal. The side missions can range from simple things like taking down militia checkpoints and disarming explosives, to more complex jobs like tracking down a serial killer, playing tag with Firefly, stopping Two-Face from robbing Gotham's banks, to even hunting down Man-Bat. This Halloween, Batman will have to contend with every manner of foe if he hopes to keep Gotham safe. But with all the gadgets at your disposal and the Batmobile on hand, you'll be more than capable of meeting these challenges head on. So don't be afraid to get creative, because some of these missions will require a bit of thinking if you hope to complete them in one piece. None more so than the AR challenges, which are the in-universe iteration of the challenge maps. They're a good way to test your skills and push your understanding of the game's mechanics while also working to upgrade Batman's capabilities. Although it's safe to say if any particular side missions are going to take up most of your time in this game, it's going to be those involving the Riddler.
So let's see how long it takes for you to turn a running start into a stumble and fall.
Considering the scope of this city, it'd be easy for anyone to lose themselves just trying to get around. Now imagine traversing this city whilst also trying to hunt down the 243 Riddler trophies that are scattered throughout it. Quite the daunting task, but if you want to 100% the game, then it's gotta be done. Needless to say, you have your work cut out for you. Remember the good old days of Arkham Asylum where the hardest challenge Eddie gave you was just to line up 2 shapes in order to make a question mark? Well, now you have to contend with puzzles involving your Batmobile, the many gadgets at your disposal, and even the Riddler's robots. You can't deny Eddie's gotten more creative over the course of this series, providing players with plenty of little puzzles to test them over the course of this lengthy campaign. Of course, the trade-off for such variety is that you'll likely end up wasting hours on these puzzles just to acquire a few trophies, a small reward for so much time and effort. Although there is the added incentive of saving Catwoman, which I think everyone can agree immediately makes this the most important mission in the whole game. So over the course of 10 trials, you'll gradually pick apart Eddie's machinations, taking on everything from supercharged racetracks to traditional puzzles and combat arenas, to even tag team games featuring both Batman and Catwoman. After which you'll need to scour every inch of this city for the rest of the Riddler's challenges. Only when everything Eddie has to offer is done and dusted can you finally bring him down and free Gotham from his snobbish attitude. It's a lot of work just to defeat one villain, but considering how much of an ass this guy is, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the most satisfying missions you can complete in the whole game. Although I do have to question why Eddie would ever think the key to beating Batman is to build a bunch of elaborate race courses. Still, he was a surprisingly good wingman for Batman, so I'll give him props for that.
How shall we celebrate? I know a couple of poor, defenseless museums, but then again, I also know a couple of hotels.
It cannot be overstated just how big Gotham City is. On average, if you solely focus on the main campaign, it can take you around 17 hours just to beat this game. But factor in all the side content throughout this open world, and the Arkham Knight can keep you occupied for well over 50 hours. This is without a doubt the most dense open world Rocksteady has ever created. On every street there's something to do, around every corner a battle to be won. And at the center of it all is you, the Batman, the ever-present guardian of a city abandoned by an unforgiving universe. And yet, here you are, ever vigilant and ready to take on whatever threat comes your way. Whether with your bare hands or behind the wheel of a car, Gotham is calling and you have all the tools you need to protect her. Of course, even after you finish the base game, you won't be starved for content. There's a whole plethora of DLC for you to enjoy, ranging from simple stuff like new challenge maps and costumes, to more story content and side missions in the open world. There's a wide selection to choose from, and they all do a pretty decent job of keeping the game fresh. With the challenge maps, Rocksteady can provide gamers with plenty of new challenges that you otherwise wouldn't find in the base game, like taking on Scarecrow in the Batmobile, or being able to drive around the Batcave in one of the car's classic designs. These are the sorts of wacky scenarios that we've come to expect from Rocksteady, and each one has been provided with the same level of quality that can be found in the base game. Furthermore, completing them also rewards players with tech points that can be spent on new upgrades, meaning more so than any other entry in this series, there's real value to be found in the challenge maps, aside from bragging rights of course. That being said though, while the new skins and challenge maps do provide the player with some additional thrills, it's pretty clear that most of Rocksteady's efforts have been devoted to the new story content. Starting with the Season of Infamy, these 4 side stories take place within the open world of Gotham City, and each one provides players with a different challenge to tackle, whilst also serving as a series of bookends for some of this franchise's biggest characters. You've got the more traditional stories, like the Mad Hatter providing Batman with one last mind-bending trip down the rabbit hole, and Killer Croc wreaking havoc on those who tormented him for their own ends. Then you've got more emotional tales like the tragic end to Mr. Freeze's quest to save his wife, and the secret war being waged over the decaying corpse of Ra's al Ghul. Each of these stories will take you throughout Gotham, exploring areas that were left untouched in the base game, or new locations that have been organically added at key points in the main story, ensuring that no corner of Gotham is spared from the madness that these villains provide. By the time you're done with the Season of Infamy, you've done everything from defusing car bombs to tracking ninjas and even fighting a giant crocodile. Needless to say, if you love exploring the open world, then the Season of Infamy is a fine addition to the base game.
Robin, RPG!
I see it!
Although what's proven to be more divisive among critics and fans are the Arkham episodes. These are a collection of short stories where you take on the role of one of the Arkhamverse's many playable characters, with each episode taking place before or after the events of the main campaign. You've got Batgirl rescuing her father from the Joker, Harley Quinn breaking Poison Ivy out of prison, Nightwing stopping the Penguin's prison break, Catwoman stealing all of the Riddler's money, Robin tracking down a recently escaped Two-Face, and the Red Hood hunting down the Black Mask. Each of these episodes feature more of the same finely tuned combat and stealth encounters that can be found in the base game. Only due to the design of these characters, you'll be far more limited with how you can approach them. Naturally, this provides each of these episodes with an extra layer of difficulty, encouraging players to be more cautious and to carefully consider their options whenever they're engaged in a fight. Needless to say, each of these story packs does a good job of showcasing their respective characters, from their gadgets to their combat prowess. However, I do wish that most of these episodes were just a bit longer. Since most of these episodes usually just consist of a series of combat and stealth encounters with very little in between, a competent player could easily finish them in just under an hour, with the only real exception being the Batgirl story pack, thanks mostly in part to the scale of the episode along with the many collectibles you can find. As a result, the rest of the episodes can feel rather lackluster, especially when compared to the sheer length of Batgirl's little adventure. Still, I can understand why the developers would want to keep things short and simple. After all, they're just a bonus little side story for the player to enjoy. They're hardly up to the scale of the Season of Infamy. That said, it is impressive how much work has gone into each of these episodes along with the characters who are tied to them. The amount of environmental detail one can find in each of these episodes is genuinely impressive. But then there's the fact that the developers went to the effort of coding every character with their own unique animations. Everything from the way they fight to the way they walk feels entirely distinct and in character. It's a far cry from the simplicity and the lack of character found in the Suicide Squad. Regardless of whatever issues that are present within the DLC, the Arkham Knight managed to do what Arkham City never could, and that's add value to its DLC. Every story being told here has a clear purpose within the narrative, whether to help build up the next generation of heroes or to provide a proper send-off to some of the Arkhamverse's biggest villains. Frankly, it says a lot that the only major issues I could find here were in regards to the length of the episodes. Aside from that, they still managed to deliver more of the same intense action that can be found in the base game, all the while being complemented by a stellar score. Up until the Suicide Squad's release, it would have been hard for anyone to dispute the quality of Rocksteady's composers. With every game, their music is able to maintain the tempo of a traditional action-adventure, whilst also evoking the gothic atmosphere that permeates throughout every inch of Gotham. This is thanks in part to Rocksteady keeping the same composers for both Arkham Asylum and City, which has allowed their themes to remain consistent in tone whilst also adapting to the new narrative each game provided. So come Arkham Knight, Rocksteady once again brought back Nick Arundel to compose the game's score, but this time around he was partnered up with David Buckley, who would be taking over the role once held by Ron Fish. Now at first you might believe David would want to introduce his own ideas into the game's soundtrack, potentially resulting in the game's atmosphere being tarnished, but thankfully that's not the case. Together he and Nick sought to create a soundtrack that emulated the themes of previous games in this franchise whilst also leaving its own impression on the player. Safe to say they succeeded. With a solid blend of action music, ambient tracks ideal for an investigative detective, and even a myriad of horror-based themes, the Arkham Knight's music is perfect for a city-spanning adventure full of mystery and intrigue. Even when you're listening to it on its own, you can't help but visualize Gotham City in all its twisted splendor. This is undeniably a soundscape that you can lose yourself in for hours on end. Every inch of this city seems to possess its own song, most of which you probably wouldn't even notice unless you were made aware of it. Whether it be big things like the roar of the ocean against the city's bulwark, or the seemingly never-ending storm that hangs overhead, to more minuscule sounds like the wind flapping against Batman's cape, the loud sirens of police cars, or the buzz of a drone hanging overhead. Never before has Gotham City felt so alive in a video game. It is simultaneously a nightmare for one's senses and a delight, whether you're in the air, on the ground, or in a car. There are sounds for every impact Batman makes, for that monster of a vehicle he drives, and for the many gadgets at your disposal. It's hard to think of any part of this game that's been left untouched by the sound department. Rocksteady has clearly gone above and beyond to deliver a soundscape that covers every corner of their game's world, leaving you in awe at what you're listening to, which when working in tandem with the game's visuals is able to deliver a one-of-a-kind experience that you can't find in any other superhero game.
I'm so proud of you, honey. Go on. Tell them what you've done.
If you ever need proof of how powerful the Unreal Engine can be, just look at Batman the Arkham Knight. The game is running on Unreal Engine 3, and throughout my entire playthrough, there was never a moment when the game forced me to endure a loading screen just to transition to a new location. Just think about that. This game came out in 2015, and it was able to deliver loading times akin to present-day consoles with frightening ease. Sure, the drawback was a much larger game size, but I reckon that's a small price to pay for speed. Speaking of present-day consoles, from a visual standpoint, this game is simply breathtaking. From the character models to the design of Gotham to the many hallucinations you may encounter throughout the game. There are so many hidden details throughout this open world that you could spend hours exploring this city and you'd likely find something new around every corner. Hell, that sentiment isn't just limited to the base game. All the DLC content comes with this same level of graphical detail. The developers have effectively ensured that every single facet of this game's design remains visually consistent, and they did so without needing to alter their game's aesthetic, allowing both the character models and the environment to look realistic while still retaining their original comic book identity. This is what has set Rocksteady's Arkhamverse apart from other video games centered around comic books. Every aspect of its visuals, from the weather to the architecture to the character designs and even the lighting, contributes to the game's aesthetic. In this day and age where most mainline developers are willing to sacrifice good character designs and appealing visuals for the sake of the message, it's nice to go back and remember that Rocksteady wasn't originally like that. They did create video games that appealed to everyone, both mechanically and visually. In my time playing Batman the Arkham Knight, there was never a moment where I wasn't left gobsmacked by how breathtaking everything is. Yet no matter how picturesque the visuals became, I could clearly tell that this was Gotham City, a place that embodies Gothic architecture, where its residents chose to dress in flamboyant outfits to sow chaos in the streets. All the while, a man dressed as a bat descends from the shadows to defend his people. It's one of the most visually distinct locations in all of DC Comics, and it brings me so much joy to see it fully realized in this game. So is Batman the Arkham Knight the perfect conclusion we were hoping for? Did it meet expectations and deliver a flawless experience? No, not by a long shot. There's clearly many areas which could have been improved upon. But does it provide a solid send-off to Rocksteady's version of Batman? One that pays respect to the Dark Knight and this franchise as a whole? Well, for the most part, yes. While the story might not have been perfect, with many of its twists and turns being far too predictable, especially if you're an avid comic book fan, this was still a well-designed game with a complex story. One that isn't afraid to hold up a mirror to one of DC's biggest superheroes and show us what kind of man he truly is underneath the mask. All the while providing gamers with plenty of new mechanics to keep the series' core combat fresh and the exploration invigorating. The Batmobile might have been a divisive addition to this game, but it goes a long way to expand the open world and provide players with plenty of unique and original situations that one wouldn't find in any other Batman game. With loads of additional content to delve into, a score that give Hans Zimmer a run for his money, and visuals that still put most modern AAA games to shame, there's simply too much to like about the Arkham Knight. It might not have been everything we were hoping for, but it's safe to say that if you're a fan of Batman, then this is the game for you.